Everyone thought he was just pacing out of habit. No one knew. Max had taken a knife to the shoulder to save a kitten. No command. No cry for help. He acted because to him, family isn't blood. It's who you choose to protect. This is not just another story about a dog. This is a heart-stopping truth about loyalty, silent love, and the kind of courage that doesn't need an audience. Watch until the very end, because the ending will change the way you see dogs forever. Welcome to Vale Marks, where every scar tells a story worth remembering. The rescue shelter at night was a world apart from its daytime self. By day, the compound buzzed with the sounds of barking, laughter, the thudding of playful paws on gravel, and the occasional clank of food bowls. But at night, everything hushed into a quiet lullaby of rustling leaves, creaking fences, and the soft hum of distant traffic. The dim yellow bulbs cast long, soft shadows along the wire enclosures, flickering gently in the breeze. It was the kind of silence that made people whisper, even if there was no one around to disturb. And through that silence, every single night without fail, came the steady sound of footsteps, not human. 4 paws, deliberate, measured, and hauntingly precise. That was Max. Max wasn't like the others. While most of the dogs curled into their beds once the sun dipped below the horizon, lulled by the safety of the shelter, Max began his nightly ritual. A pit bull with a slate-gray coat and a broad, muscular frame, Max moved with a kind of calm authority. His eyes, sharp, amber-hued, always alert, scanned the fences, the trees, the shadows. It wasn't aggression. It was duty. No one ever told Max to patrol. No one trained him to walk that path, to sniff every corner of the fence line, to pause at the gates like a silent sentinel. But he did it, every single night. Rain or cold, wind or snow, Max walked. The new volunteers found it unsettling at first. They'd glance up from their checklists to see Max staring out into the darkness, his body stiff, ears perked, tail still. Some of them joked nervously. Maybe he sees ghosts. Others whispered, he thinks he's still a guard dog. But the old staff, the ones who'd been around long enough to understand the deeper things animals carried, said little. They only watched Max with a quiet sort of respect, and sometimes a little sadness. "That dog," said Tom, a retired firefighter who now spent his evenings cleaning kennels and fixing fences. "He doesn't patrol because he has to. He patrols because he's still holding on to something. Maybe someone." Max never barked at shadows. He never charged the fence. He didn't growl at stray cats or chase raccoons the way some of the younger dogs did. No, Max simply observed. There was an eerie elegance in the way he moved, like a soldier still on post long after the war had ended, unable to believe it was truly over. Some nights, when the moon was full and bright enough to light the yard like a stage, Max would pause in the center of the enclosure and look up. Not at the moon, but toward the staff building. He'd sit down slowly, his ears twitching at some distant sound only he could hear, and then, after a few minutes, resume his patrol. One evening, a volunteer named Sarah stayed late to inventory supplies. As she closed the storeroom, she caught sight of Max pacing along the eastern fence. His silhouette moved like a ghost through the mist curling up from the grass. She watched, half hidden behind a stack of storage bins. Max stopped suddenly, ears high, body low. He sniffed the air, then turned his head ever so slightly, just enough to glance toward the staff building again. Sarah held her breath. It was as though Max was waiting for something. Or someone. The next day she asked Tom, "Do you think Max is remembering something from before?" Tom took a long sip of his coffee before answering. "You ever lose something that meant everything, and not even know what part of it you're really grieving? That's what Max feels like. He ain't just remembering. He's still living it." Sarah fell quiet. She hadn't thought of it that way. Max had arrived at the shelter nearly a year ago. No one knew much about his past, only that he'd come from a security training program and had been deemed unfit after an incident they never explained. No aggression reports, no bites, just a note in his file. Unable to adjust, withdrawn, possibly depressed. But in the shelter, Max was never violent. He wasn't affectionate either, at least not openly. He tolerated the occasional pat on the head, sat obediently for his food, and ignored the chaos around him with the poise of a weary veteran. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he cared too much, in a language no one else spoke. And every night, without fail, he kept watch. What was he guarding? No one knew. There was nothing here to protect. Not really. Just a bunch of old buildings, tired staff, and animals with stories as bruised and silent as his. But Max moved as though the whole world depended on his vigilance. Maybe in his mind it still did. Maybe Max didn't believe the war was over. Maybe his soul couldn't rest until he was sure everyone, every dog, every cat, every human, was safe. Or maybe, just maybe, Max wasn't guarding the shelter. Maybe he was guarding hope, a flicker of something he once had, a family, a purpose, a love. As Tom turned off the last light and closed the gate behind him that night, he looked back at the yard and saw Max standing under the old oak tree. Still, watchful, proud. "Sleep easy, soldier," Tom whispered. Max didn't move, but his ears twitched, ever so slightly. The night deepened, and Max resumed his silent patrol, alone in the shadows but never lost, because somewhere deep inside, something still mattered enough to guard. And Max, he was still willing to fight for it. Long before Max ever set foot in the shelter's gravel-covered yard, long before his nightly patrols and quiet watchfulness, he had lived a very different life, one of discipline, structure, and constant alertness. He was not always a shelter dog. Once he was respected. Once he was chosen. Max had been bred for strength and focus, selected from a litter of pitbull puppies for a special program that trained dogs for high-risk security work. From the time he could run, Max was trained to obey, to protect, to stay sharp under pressure. He was drilled in controlled environments, exposed to loud noises, flashing lights, strangers yelling. While other dogs flinched or grew too anxious, Max stayed still, stoic, ready. They called him a natural. By age 2, Max was assigned to a private security firm contracted for industrial sites and freight depots. He wore a badge of sorts, a custom harness with a bright patch that read, "Security Unit." He accompanied handlers during late-night shifts, sniffed out intrusions, and stood guard in places where people rarely came unless they were up to no good. To Max, it was purpose, and purpose gave him peace. But there was one night that changed everything. The official report simply called it an incident. But the details were sparse, and no one at the shelter ever got the full story. What they knew was this. During a routine patrol at an abandoned warehouse, Max and his handler were ambushed by a pair of thieves. One of them panicked and threw a metal pipe. Max lunged to protect his handler, taking the blow to his ribs. Though he held his ground and drove the intruders away, the injury left more than bruises. It cracked something deeper. After that, Max changed. He became less responsive to commands, slower to trust, more withdrawn. The security firm said he was losing edge and quietly removed him from rotation. The handler, his partner, his anchor, was reassigned. Max was passed off to another facility, then another. No one wanted to deal with a dog that was no longer sharp enough for work, but too intense for adoption. Eventually, Max was labeled unsuitable for reassignment and ended up in the system, the kind of place dogs like him are often forgotten. When Max arrived at the shelter, he didn't bark, he didn't cower, he didn't wag his tail. He just stood in the corner of his enclosure, muscles tight, eyes unmoving. His presence felt heavy, as though he brought the weight of his past with him in every step. For the first few weeks, Max barely ate. He turned his nose away from treats, ignored toys, and recoiled slightly when anyone tried to reach in. Most of the dogs warmed up quickly to the volunteers. Max didn't, especially at night. While the others curled up and slept, Max stood. He paced. He scanned the gates, the trees, the sky. "He doesn't sleep like a dog," one volunteer said. "He sleeps like a soldier on duty." And maybe that's exactly what he still believed he was. No one at the shelter hated Max for his distance. In fact, there was something about him that inspired quiet reverence. He wasn't aggressive, he simply chose solitude. He kept his distance from the noisy puppies and the excitable hounds. When another dog barked wildly, Max would glance once, then look away. He didn't react to nonsense. He didn't entertain drama. He was an old soul in a young dog's body. There were moments, small and rare, when Max showed flickers of vulnerability. One rainy evening, when thunder cracked and several dogs whimpered, Max didn't flinch, but he walked slowly to the edge of his pen and sat by the door. When a staff member approached, umbrella in hand, Max looked up, not with fear, but with something like recognition. He didn't move closer, but he didn't pull away either. It was in moments like these that the staff began to see him differently. Not as a broken dog, but as one who had been loyal beyond reason, who had given everything, his strength, his heart, to a life that cast him aside the moment he faltered. "Some dogs bark for attention," said Rosa, the shelter's head caretaker. "But Max, he listens, he remembers." She was right. Max remembered the way schedules were kept, the way shifts were rotated. He knew the rhythm of night and day, understood the subtle tension in footsteps, the click of keys, the way people walked when they meant trouble. He wasn't watching the fence for fun. He was still protecting someone, even if that someone wasn't there anymore. Over time, Max became a presence. Not just another dog in the shelter, but part of it. He never played fetch, never chased tennis balls. But when new dogs were brought in, Max was always the first to sense their fear. He didn't go near them, but he'd watch from afar, making sure nothing got out of hand. Some of the staff started calling him the Night Guard, a nickname said half in jest, half in awe. No one ever tried to change Max. They didn't force affection on him or expect him to be like the others. They just let him be. And in that quiet acceptance, Max seemed to find his own rhythm. He would lie under the same tree every morning, his gaze toward the rising sun. And every evening, when the last volunteer went home and the final lights dimmed, he would rise again, resuming his post. Whatever haunted Max's past, he never spoke of it. Of course, dogs don't speak in words, but they speak in silence, in loyalty, in the way they keep walking, even when no one is watching. Max never asked for comfort, but he gave protection, not out of instinct but out of something deeper, a need to matter, a refusal to be forgotten. And perhaps in that, Max found his truest self, not as a guard dog discarded by a system, but as a quiet soul who still believed in the duty of love. Even if no one truly understood him, Max didn't need them to, because he knew who he was. And that was enough. It was early October when Lily first came to the shelter, a crisp autumn breeze trailing behind her as she skipped across the fallen leaves. Her bright red jacket stood out against the soft grays and browns of the rescue center, and her laughter carried through the chilly air like a warm melody. She was the kind of child who found beauty in broken things, who whispered to the wind, and who believed even the most wounded souls deserved love. Lily's father, Jeremy, worked maintenance at the shelter. He fixed pipes, patched fences, and kept the old place running through long shifts and tight budgets. Normally, Lily stayed home after school, but that week her mom was out of town, and so the shelter became her after-school playground. It didn't take long for her to notice Max. Unlike the other dogs that barked excitedly when she walked past their enclosures, Max remained quiet. his eyes shadowed beneath his low brow, his body still. She was drawn to him not out of excitement, but out of curiosity. "Why doesn't he come over?" she asked her dad. Jeremy looked over at Max, who sat like a statue under the oak tree near the fence line. "Max is different. He's been through a lot. He just likes his space." Lily tilted her head, squinting at Max from a distance. "He looks lonely." Her dad smiled softly. "Maybe. Or maybe he just likes being alone." But Lily didn't believe in just being alone. The next day, she returned with a bundle in her jacket. It meowed. "I found him near the bus stop," she whispered, unzipping her coat to reveal a scrawny, shivering kitten with one matted eye and trembling paws. Its fur was patchy, its ribs visible beneath the skin, and it looked far too small to be wandering the world alone. "I named him Peanut," she said, stroking the kitten's head gently. Jeremy sighed but couldn't say no. He made a temporary space for Peanut in an empty supply crate in the staff room and promised to get medicine from the vet tech in the morning. That evening, as the sun began to fade and the sky turned a dusky orange, Lily sat near Max's enclosure, cradling Peanut in her arms. She didn't say much, just hummed softly and let the silence settle. Max didn't look at her, didn't move, but his ears twitched once. "Hey," Lily whispered, "I know you don't want to be friends." But maybe Peanut does. She set the kitten down gently, just beyond the fence line of Max's spot under the oak. Peanut took a few wobbly steps, then curled into a tiny ball right where the sunlight kissed the grass. Max glanced sideways, then looked away again. The next few days became routine. Lily would sit with Peanut and Max after school, reading from her favorite books or just watching the sky change colors. Peanut grew sicker, though. He stopped eating. His breathing grew shallow. One afternoon, Lily didn't read. She just cried. "Please don't go," she whispered to the kitten, clutching him tightly. "Please don't die. I don't want to be alone." She didn't notice Max rise slowly to his feet. She didn't hear the soft sound of his paws on the ground as he stepped closer to the fence, closer to her. When Jeremy came out later that night to lock up, he found a scene that stopped him cold. There, under the oak, Max was lying down. His massive frame curled protectively around the tiny kitten, his nose resting gently beside it. Peanut, despite his weakness, had pressed himself against Max's warm belly. And nearby, Lily had fallen asleep on a blanket, her hands stretched through the fence, barely touching Max's paw. For the first time since Max had arrived, he wasn't alone. Something shifted after that night. Max began to tolerate the kitten's presence. Then, he began to expect it. Peanut, miraculously, began to recover. The medicine helped, but so did the warmth, the company, and maybe even the sense of belonging. And Lily, she kept coming, rain or shine. She would run to Max's spot with stories to tell, bandages for Peanut's paw, or even just a warm smile. Sometimes Max would lift his head when she arrived. Once, she swore she saw his tail twitch. One Saturday morning, Lily arrived early and crept quietly toward the oak tree. She didn't want to wake anyone, but what she saw made her heart swell. Max was sleeping, truly sleeping, for the first time in weeks. His body was relaxed, his breathing steady. Curled up right between his front legs like a tiny guardian of a giant was Peanut, safe, sound, and snoring softly. Lily didn't say a word. She just sat nearby, hugging her knees, and smiled. They weren't just animals anymore. They were hers, her friends. And somehow, in their quiet way, Max and Peanut had chosen her too. The old shelter with its squeaky gates and fading paint had become the unlikely stage for a new story. One about healing, one about connection, one about three souls, one guarded, one fragile, and one fearless, finding each other when the world had nearly forgotten them. From that day on, Max's nightly patrols had a new purpose. He wasn't just watching the fence, he was watching over them. The crisp autumn nights gradually gave way to the softer hush of early winter. The leaves that once danced in the wind now carpeted the ground, damp and golden under Max's steady paws. The wind had a sharper bite, and the stars seemed to hang lower, clearer, as if listening in on the quiet conversations of the earth below. At the shelter, the rhythm of life continued. Feeding schedules, vet visits, new arrivals, but something had shifted, subtly, unmistakably. Max still walked his rounds each night, the ritual as sacred as ever. But now, something was different. He wasn't patrolling the entire perimeter like before. These days, Max's steps would slow near the eastern wing of the shelter, where the small staff quarters stood. More specifically, outside one particular window, Lily's. Inside, the girl often lay curled up in her bunk bed under a thick, cartoon-printed comforter, her chest rising and falling with the innocence of sleep. Sometimes she left the light on, sometimes she talked in her sleep. And Max? He would stop at that window, glance in, ears forward, and stay there for a minute or two, watching, waiting, not because he expected trouble, but because she was his to protect now. He would then continue his rounds, content in the knowledge that she and Peanut were safe. Peanut had grown from a sickly scrap of fur into a lively, scrappy little cat with an attitude much larger than his body. He zipped around the shelter grounds like he owned the place, darting between bowls, weaving through kennels, and often launching sneak attacks on piles of fallen leaves. But wherever Max went, Peanut followed, like a tiny shadow with 4 paws and a twitchy tail. They were an odd pair. The hardened pitbull with a soldier's bearing and the mischievous feline with no sense of caution. Yet they moved together in sync, Max with steady purpose, Peanut with childlike curiosity. Some nights, staff members would peek through the blinds and chuckle softly as they watched Max sit guard beneath the oak tree while Peanut climbed his back, balancing between his shoulders like a king atop a throne. It was impossible not to notice the transformation. Max, once cold and unreachable, no longer flinched when approached. He didn't bark aimlessly. He no longer paced with frantic energy or stood rigid at the gates for hours on end. He had stopped searching for something. Instead, he had begun guarding something. It wasn't the shelter itself he was protecting. It was the pieces of it that had begun to matter. Lily, Peanut, the warm lights inside the staff wing, the routine of peanut butter treats and gentle hands. "He doesn't look like he's on alert anymore," said Rosa one evening, sipping tea with a blanket around her shoulders. "He looks like he's keeping watch over something he finally believes is his." Jeremy, wiping his hands with an old rag, glanced toward Max sitting calmly beside the garden bed. Peanut had curled up beside him, grooming one paw lazily. "I think Max has found his family," he said. "He just doesn't want to lose it." From that point on, Max was no longer just the quiet one or the old soul. He was the shelter's heart. New volunteers were taught to respect Max's space, but they were also told his story, how he never gave up, how he found his purpose again, not through training or commands, but through trust, through love. There were still moments when the old instincts flickered. A loud bang, a sudden shout from a new dog. Max's ears would perk, his body tense. But it passed. He no longer lived in fear. He lived in the present. Sometimes, during the late shift, Jeremy would walk the grounds, flashlight in hand, and find Max sitting near the playground where Lily liked to draw chalk animals on the pavement. The drawings faded with each rain, but Max always seemed to sit in the same spot, as if keeping them alive a little longer. Other times, the staff would find Peanut's toys mysteriously moved, dragged closer to Max's bed, lined up beside the fence as if arranged for an inspection. It was these little things that told the real story. Max hadn't just adjusted to life at the shelter, he had chosen it. Chosen them. On one particularly cold night, as snow flurried gently under the glow of the porch light, Max stood outside Lily's window longer than usual. Inside, she had fallen asleep at her desk, a crayon still in hand, a half-drawn picture in front of her. The image showed three figures, one small girl, one big dog, and one tiny cat. Jeremy walked up behind Max, hands deep in his jacket pockets. "That's you," he said softly, nodding toward the window. Max didn't move. "You're not guarding a building anymore," Jeremy added, his voice tinged with something close to awe. "You're guarding a home." And in that moment, nothing needed to be said. Max knew. They all knew. Whatever ghosts Max had carried into the shelter, whatever memories he still tucked away behind his steady eyes, he had finally let one thing in: love. And in return, he gave the only thing he knew how to give: his protection, his presence, his quiet, unwavering watch. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because he belonged. It was the kind of night that wrapped everything in silence, the kind of cold that seeped through walls and into bones, making the world feel like it was holding its breath. Frost coated the shelter's windows like fragile lace, and even the most restless dogs had curled into tight balls, surrendering to sleep. The wind whispered gently, nothing more than a hush through the trees, and the lights from the main building flickered softly under the thick blanket of darkness. Everything seemed still, too still, except Max. Something wasn't right. He had started his patrol like every other night, shoulders squared, steps measured. But within minutes, his behavior shifted. His ears twitched at sounds others couldn't hear. His body grew tense, his tail lowered, his nose to the ground as he sniffed with urgency. He wasn't just patrolling anymore. He was searching. Max moved faster than usual, pacing along the fences, circling twice, 3 times, his breath misting in the freezing air. Every few steps he paused, listening, ears perked, muscles braced, eyes locked into the darkness as if trying to pull danger from the shadows. Inside the staff quarters, Jeremy had just finished checking the furnace. He paused by the window to watch Max. Something about the dog's movement made his skin prickle. "Rosa," he called softly to the night staffer. "Max is acting strange." She joined him, squinting through the frosted glass. "Looks like he's tracking something." "Or someone," Jeremy muttered. Then it happened. Max stopped dead in his tracks, head low, growling, not loud but low and guttural, like a warning pulled from deep within his chest. A second later, he bolted, not a run, a full sprint, straight toward the back storage building. Jeremy's heart dropped. Out back, the old supply shed sat at the edge of the property, mostly used for storing donated food, medical kits, and cleaning supplies. It was locked at all times, but there were no cameras, just a rusted padlock and the trust that no one would bother with it. But tonight, someone did. Max's growl turned into a bark, a sound none of the staff had heard in months. It was loud, fierce, echoing across the property like a gunshot in the silence. By the time Jeremy reached the back door, flashlight in hand and heart hammering, Max was already in full confrontation. A shadowy figure, hooded, thin, and clearly panicked, was crouched at the shed door, tools scattered around him. The padlock lay broken on the ground. The intruder had one hand on a bag filled with cans and another wrapped tightly around a hunting knife. "Hey!" Jeremy shouted, but the man didn't run, not with Max blocking the only way out. Max stood his ground, his body tense and ready. He didn't lunge. He didn't bark again. He watched, calculating, waiting for the right move. Then a small, unexpected sound broke the tension. Meow. Jeremy's eyes widened. Peanut. The little cat had slipped through a side hole in the fence earlier, as he often did, chasing something or just following Max like always. No one had noticed he'd wandered back there. And now, in the worst possible place, Peanut had made himself known. his tiny body trembling near the edge of the shed, just feet away from the intruder. The man startled at the sound, his eyes darting toward the kitten. With one quick motion, he raised the knife, not toward Max, but toward the small, defenseless creature beside the crate. "No!" Jeremy shouted, his feet frozen in horror. But Max didn't wait. With a roar that shook the night, Max lunged. The scene unfolded in seconds. Max launched his entire weight into the man's side, knocking him off balance. The knife clattered to the ground, skidding away. The intruder let out a cry, struggling under Max's massive weight as the dog pinned him down, snarling. Jeremy ran forward, grabbing the knife and kicking it out of reach. Rosa was already on the radio, calling for help. Peanut, meanwhile, darted under a stack of crates, his fur puffed and his eyes wide, but unharmed. The police arrived minutes later, finding the would-be thief flat on the frozen ground, subdued by one very determined pit bull who refused to leave his post until Jeremy gave a quiet command. Back in the shelter, Max was finally led inside. He limped slightly. One of his paws had been scraped in the struggle. But he didn't whine. He didn't look tired. If anything, he looked calm. Rosa knelt beside him and rubbed the fur behind his ear. "You did good, soldier," she whispered. Peanut came cautiously toward Max, brushing his side and giving a soft, uncertain chirp. Max lay down slowly and let Peanut curl against him. There was no need for barking now, no need for pacing or growling, because Max had proven, beyond any doubt, what he had always known. He wasn't guarding a building. He was guarding family. And he had just saved it. The darkness of the shelter grounds was shattered in a sudden burst of chaos, metal clattering against concrete, a deep, guttural growl, and then a sharp yelp that rang through the cold winter air like a cracked bell. Max had taken the hit. The knife had caught him just above the shoulder, slicing into muscle, warm blood soaking into his thick gray fur. But he didn't back down, didn't falter. As the blade struck, Max did the only thing he knew. He lunged forward with all the force he had left, his jaws bared, his growl turning into a furious roar. He drove the intruder back, using his weight to pin the man against the shed wall, snarling inches from his face. The man dropped the knife in panic, stumbling as he tried to regain his balance, but Max stayed between him and Peanut, his body forming a shield over the small kitten still crouched behind the crates, eyes wide with terror. Inside the shelter, the barking had begun. One dog after another had picked up the alarm, their voices rising like a wave. Jeremy and Rosa, already on high alert from Max's earlier behavior, rushed toward the back storage building, flashlights bobbing wildly. Then came the click of the security lights. The flood lamps burst to life, throwing the backyard into sudden, blinding brightness. And there he was. Max stood in a loose crouch, his side heaving, blood dripping onto the snow-mottled ground. His shoulder was torn, the fur matted and red. But he stood his ground, teeth bared, body coiled like a spring. Behind him, Peanut trembled under a wooden pallet, eyes locked on Max with complete innocent trust. The would-be thief was crouched nearby, breathless, clearly trying to decide if escape was still possible. But when Rosa shouted, "Stop right there!" and Jeremy raised the flashlight toward his face, the man froze like a deer in headlights. In moments, the police arrived, flashing red and blue cutting across the cold night. They took the man without incident. He didn't struggle, maybe because he'd already been subdued in the most humiliating way imaginable, by a pit bull most assumed was too old to matter. But all eyes were on Max. He was still standing, but barely. His legs trembled with the effort, and a soft whine escaped his throat. Yet when Jeremy took a step forward, Max didn't move away. He simply turned his head ever so slightly as if giving permission. "He's hurt. Bad," Rosa whispered, already moving for the emergency kit. "No," Jeremy said, stepping forward. "He's more than that." Max collapsed gently to the ground, careful not to land on his wounded shoulder. Peanut, sensing the shift, crept from his hiding spot and curled against Max's chest. Max lowered his head beside the kitten and closed his eyes, his breath shallow but steady. Rosa knelt down, pressing a cloth to the wound. "You stayed," she whispered, voice trembling. "You didn't run. You protected him." The vet tech, who had arrived with the emergency crew, quickly took over. Max was loaded onto a stretcher, something the old Max might have resisted with every fiber of his being. But tonight, he allowed it. He let the people he once kept at arm's length tend to him, because tonight he had done what he came to do. He had protected his family, and now it was their turn to protect him. As the stretcher wheeled past the kennel building, the dogs inside were silent, eerily so. They watched. They seemed to know. Peanut was placed in a warm carrier and rode along beside him. Lily, having been woken by the noise and escorted by her father, sat in the front of the van, eyes brimming with tears. "I don't want him to die," she whispered. "He won't," Jeremy said softly, one hand on her shoulder. "He's stronger than any of us thought." Back at the shelter, the staff gathered in the break room, replaying what had happened over and over again. Some were in shock, some were crying. Others simply sat in silence, cups of untouched coffee cooling in their hands. "He took a knife," one of the junior volunteers finally said. "For a cat. For our cat." "For his cat," Rosa corrected. The room fell quiet again. The next day, word of Max's bravery spread beyond the walls of the shelter. Animal rescue forums shared the story. The police wrote a commendation for heroic action performed by a shelter animal. A local news crew asked to do a feature, but none of that really mattered to the staff. What mattered was this. Max had been misunderstood for so long, written off as damaged, too serious, too withdrawn to ever be normal. People had whispered that he was broken, haunted, maybe even dangerous. But now, all they saw was a guardian, a protector, a silent warrior who had never stopped believing that he still had something worth fighting for. Max hadn't barked at shadows. He hadn't growled at ghosts. He had waited patiently, watched quietly, and acted with absolute courage the moment it counted most. No one would ever again call him that old guard dog. He was a hero, a father in his own silent way. And as he lay in the animal hospital, bandaged and sedated, with Peanut curled beside him and Lily's drawing of the three of them taped above his bed, the truth was undeniable. Max had never been lost. He had simply been waiting to be needed, waiting for the chance to show who he really was. And in that single night, bathed in the red of his own blood and the glow of a floodlight, Max finally proved it. He wasn't watching the world because he feared it. He was watching because he loved it. And he would have given everything to protect the ones who finally loved him back. Max's return to the shelter came quietly, a few days after the surgery that patched up his shoulder and stitched together what no one could ever call just a wound. It was more than torn flesh. It was the final chapter in a long story of loss, loyalty, and love. He limped slightly as he stepped down from the rescue van, but his eyes were clear, steady, and unafraid. The staff had been waiting for him. Rosa wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve as Jeremy opened the kennel gate. Lily stood just inside, arms wrapped tightly around a small bundle of ginger and white fluff. Peanut, who had refused to eat or sleep properly since Max had been taken away. The moment Max crossed the threshold, Peanut wriggled free and darted to him, pressing his face against Max's side, right near the bandaged wound. Max flinched, not in pain but in surprise. Then, slowly, he lowered his head to nuzzle the tiny cat, exhaling a low, comforting sound. From that moment on, Peanut didn't leave his side. In the following weeks, Max's recovery became a shared mission. Volunteers brought him blankets warmed in the dryer, bowls of broth, and even stuffed toys that someone joked were comfort animals for the comfort animal. But Max didn't need toys. He had his people now, and they had him. Peanut remained his silent companion, often curled beside Max with one paw resting lightly on the bandages, as if trying to protect the protector. At night, Peanut would lie close, purring so softly it was more like a hum than a sound, soothing Max into sleep. Staff often found them in the morning, Max sprawled out like a tired soldier, Peanut nestled at his chest, and Lily's handmade drawing tucked into the kennel gate, still fluttering with the wind. Lily visited every afternoon after school, never missing a day. She'd sit beside Max, reading aloud or drawing quietly, speaking to him as if he understood every word. And maybe he did. Maybe not every syllable, but every feeling. One afternoon, as she pressed her cheek against his thick neck, her fingers softly brushing the scar that peeked from beneath the healing fur, she whispered, "I know why you walk the yard every night." Max lifted his head slightly. "You weren't trying to find the past," she said. "You were protecting what you had now. You were guarding us." She paused, then added, "You were guarding your family." There was no dramatic music, no tearful applause. Just a still moment, quiet and powerful, as Max leaned into her touch, eyes closing in trust. From then on, Max resumed his night walks. He wasn't as fast as before, and the limp never fully left his step, but his path was sure, confident. He no longer scanned the horizon for threats. Instead, he stopped outside windows, peered in to check on the sleeping, and occasionally paused beneath the old oak tree, lifting his face to the sky as if thanking the moon for keeping watch alongside him. Peanut followed, of course, no longer a helpless kitten, but a clever, quick-footed companion. He often darted ahead of Max, hopping onto fence rails, batting at stray moths, then trotting back to fall in line beside the big dog's steady pace. They were two parts of the same soul, one born for vigilance, the other for lightness, but both bound by something deeper than instinct. Volunteers and staff began leaving little lights on in the windows, as if to signal, "We're here, Max, and we see you." Some joked about getting him an official uniform. Others simply said, "Thank you," when they passed him in the halls. Even new dogs, fresh from trauma and confusion, seemed calmer in Max's presence. He had become something more than a shelter dog. He was its keeper, its heartbeat. Visitors to the shelter often paused at the sight of him. "That's Max," someone would explain. "He saved a kitten, took a knife for him. He walks the yard every night." And the visitors would watch as Max patrolled quietly, tail low, Peanut at his side, their shadows long under the silver moon. Jeremy once said, "He's not watching for danger anymore. He's watching to make sure what matters stays safe." Late one night, as the wind rolled gently across the hills and a light frost began to settle on the grass, Lily stood at her window, watching Max as he made his rounds. The moon cast a soft white glow over the yard, and Max, strong and scarred, moved slowly but purposefully through the silence. Peanut walked just behind him, tail high, eyes alert, pausing whenever Max did. They stopped at the gate, then the garden, then finally beneath the oak tree, Max's favorite spot. Lily pressed her forehead to the glass, her breath fogging the pain. She whispered, "You're not alone anymore." Outside, Max turned his head toward the window. His ears twitched, and for just a moment he stood completely still, bathed in moonlight, as if he knew she was watching. He blinked slowly. Then, with Peanut beside him, he continued into the night, not as a ghost chasing the past, but as a guardian of the present, a sentinel of love. His scars would always be there, but so would the family he chose. And the heart inside him? That heart would never sleep. Because Max, the pitbull once forgotten, once feared, once misunderstood, had become something far greater. He was the night watcher of love. And as long as someone needed protecting, he would be there. Max wasn't just a shelter dog. He was a protector, a friend, a father in silence. And maybe in a world so loud, the ones who say the least often love the most. As Helen Keller once said, "What we have once enjoyed deeply, we can never lose. All that we love deeply becomes a part of us." If Max's journey touched something inside you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and let his legacy live on. Subscribe to Vale Marks and help us reach 1,000 hearts. We need your support to continue creating meaningful, soul-stirring stories like this one. Because every story here holds more than words. It holds a message, one that just might stay with you forever.